It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Major General John Phillips, Commanding General, 335th Signal Command. Sir, thank you for being here.
Okay, hey, thanks everyone. It's actually good to be back at Georgia Tech. Many years ago, 21 now, I think I was a young captain teaching ROTC in a wooden building now that's probably been torn down. I should go back and see. It was actually underneath the football stadium partially. The worst of the three service ROTC programs, Air Force and Navy, predominantly bigger at Georgia Tech, although I'm proud to say, having just spoke at their commencement ceremony about 2 weeks ago, they had more than the Air Force and the Navy combined, so it's good news on the Army front at Georgia Tech. So it's good to be back. A lot of former teammates in the room. I'll probably throw their names out there, but I don't want to be remiss in introducing my current teammate, Command Sergeant Major Russ Price. Joined our team on paper a little over a month and a half ago as our newest Command Sergeant Major of the 335th, replacing Command Sergeant Major Edward Simpson, who's recovering from a motorcycle accident, who should still be our CSM tenure-wise, but had a bad accident shortly after COVID started last summer. So a lot of people have already commented on this uniform. You're the first group to see me wear this variant of this uniform. They call it the Ike jacket. It's the version that Eisenhower would wear, so no buttons, and it doesn't come down to midway on the waist, and it is a lot more comfortable. And coming from Army Europe, and I'm going to talk about my former job, probably as much, if not more, than my current one, to give perspective. Getting this uniform for an Army in Europe and having a green uniform I cannot tell you how powerful that was. Attending the 100th anniversary of the armistice of World War I as a brigadier general in Lisbon, Portugal. I had more people come up to me and ask me, "So, Admiral, what do you do?" And that blue uniform with all that gold. So it's nice to have green. Only bad thing is I got it about a week after the 75th anniversary of D-Day. So we are the Army's Expeditionary Signal Command. There are only two left, technically. There's a third one, but it is a TDA. It doesn't have equipment per se, and so it is just an organization, and it manages CONUS NECs. So there's really only two deployable signal commands, and I'll get into that in a second. And if I could learn how to do this. And so this is what we do. And so I had to ask myself, and I had grown up for a good bit of my Army career in the 335th Signal Command. But I don't think many people really knew what a signal command did, because for 19, going on 20 years this November, or this October, the 335th, or elements of it, will have been deployed to Southwest Asia for 20 years. I'm almost adding the word in perpetuity because there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. So what does a signal command do? Really didn't know until I got to my next job, my previous job, as the G6 of Army Europe. And we were looking at op plans, pretty much devoid of a signal command. Because one wasn't available for the European theater of operations because it was committed to Southwest Asia. But the 335th is probably the most unique and obscure organization inside the Army Reserve because the majority of our organizations are your traditional DODN ops or tactical signal organizations. The Army Reserve, for years, have built itself in being that large behemoth of an organization that can assist the active duty when the nation needs it, predominantly with providing very heavy logistic organizations that aren't needed for day-to-day operations in the active component. I would say that's now becoming signal and logistics as you look at the Army Reserve. If you look at the Army Reserve as a whole, or the active Army as a whole, like I said, there's only two signal commands that are commanded by general officers that are deployable and can serve a combatant commander to manage multiple signal brigades. Both are in Compo 3 or the Army Reserve. none an active component. If you look at the signal brigades, those deployable green CARC-painted equipment signal brigades that can manage multiple signal battalions, there's a total of 6 in the Army inventory. 2 in the active component, 2 in the National Guard, and 2 in the Army Reserve. And if you look at the signal battalions itself, about 70%, 65% are in the National Guard and the Army Reserve, with only 8, and they're downsizing to 7. And if I heard correctly just last week, that's probably going to go to 6 tactical signal battalions in the active component. Because day-to-day operations, non-wartime, they go with strategic signal sites, or our NECs, or Network Enterprise Centers, and use those strategic services on a day-to-day basis. They only use the signal battalions when you have to go to obscure places where infrastructure does not exist. Think plains of Poland, if we're fighting an adversary in Eastern Europe, or the safaris of Africa, if you were fighting a global pandemic, not COVID-19. But what we also do, and if you look at those organizations that exist in the 335, that's about 70%, 80% of our portfolio. Much like Army Cyber Command, 80% of their portfolio is traditional DoDN ops, even though they're named Army Cyber Command. About 16% of Army Cyber Command is cyber operational forces that conduct either offensive cyber or defensive cyber capability. About 16% of my portfolio is 10 cyber protection teams underneath an Army Reserve Cyber Protection Brigade, and that accounts for about 16% of my portfolio, leaving about 4% left. And if you look at the 4% left in Army Cyber Command, it's the growing mission of information operations. And if you look at the remaining 4% of my portfolio, it is represented off there to the right. See if I can do the pointer right. And so we as an organization really interact with 4 different commands. Not many people really have 4. I have a boss. Let me go on record saying I have a boss. But I have many people giving me chores on a daily basis. Okay? It's like the kid who lives with his mom and dad, but the uncle lives next door who's always telling him to clean out the pool, and then a brother that lives across the street and having him hedge the bushes. And so we send a 1-star command. They just swapped out in Southwest Asia just about 2 weeks ago. My former deputy, General John Moyer, is now the commander of the 335th Signal Command Theater Provisional, exact same name until you get to the word provisional, that's been in Southwest Asia since 2005, when the 335th Theater had to come home because it had been there so long, 4 years, under 2 different 2-star generals. So we do have that relationship with Central Command and U.S. Army Central, located up at Shaw Air Force Base in Sumter, South Carolina. It was a lot easier when they were just about a mile north of our headquarters in East Point, when they were at formerly known as Fort McPherson, now Tyler Perry Studios. Then we also provide a plethora of organizations that form an Army Reserve element or a Reserve element, if it's an Army command, to different COCOMs. And so we have the largest component of the Joint Enabling Capabilities Command, under which is one of the 6 squadrons of the Joint Communications Support Element out of MacDill, Florida. These are 6 battalions or squadrons. They go out on moment's notice to provide JTF-like capable signal organizations that provide mission command support for organizations wherever they go. So we have that relationship with Transcom. We have that also relationship. I have a Army Reserve element as part of U.S. Cyber Command at Fort Meade. And then we do the same thing with the Defense Information Systems Agency, also out of Fort Meade. And I have DISA organizations at about 6 locations in CONUS. And then Army Cyber. Army Cyber, being the highest Army signal organization, does give our command, when it does DODN operations, a communication tasking order authority. So as we stand up networks for any exercises whatsoever, we touch the DODN, we get any tasking orders that relate to either cyber defense, patching, information assurance type compliance. That all comes through Army Cyber. And then I also, through Army Cyber's information First IO Command, I provide an Army Reserve element. About 1/3 of First IO Command is actually Army Reservists provided through the 335th Signal Command. So a lot of uncles and aunts that we talk to, but it makes for a very unique, diverse organization. But a Signal Command does just that for a theater. The way our network is devised, it is partitioned or compartmentalized, if you will, for lack of a better term. We have a CONUS network, but if you go to Army Europe and you're a unit here at Fort Bragg and you deploy to Poland for an alignment mission, you have to re-baseline all your computers because you're on a new domain. You have to completely do a digital integration, just as you do to go to Southwest Asia. If you go to the Pacific, for cyber defensive purposes, we compartmentalize our huge Army network. And so that theater signal command would do all the management for DODN operations inside that theater. Pretty easy for the most part in peacetime, with the exception of continual. In fact, in my last job as the CIO G6 of Army Europe, I would say 80% of my job was the CIO and 20% was the G6. Yet all my development up to that point was really to do the G6 job. And so I had to learn 80% of my new job pretty rapidly when it came to there. As I said, the 2-star headquarters is back here. A good portion of my staff is here. But every 9 to 12 months, I rotate 1/3 of it forward to Kuwait, and then it works for Army Central Command. Kind of hard to do that mission for anybody else when you have that persistent mission taking huge capability away from you going forward. So right now, General Cavoli in Army Europe does not have a signal command. They deactivated the last one about 5 years ago in Army Europe, and they don't have one. Day-to-day operations, they have a brigade over there with 1 tactical signal battalion. Fairly easy for a staff officer and a brigade to manage that. But if we were to ramp up forces in Army Europe and you deployed a 2nd signal brigade, I don't care if you pick the 2 nicest 06 signal brigade commanders in the world that might be twin brothers, the chances that they're going to agree on everything and agree in how to establish the network without having someone above them in a hierarchy is unlikely. And so that's what a signal command would do, is provide mission command and direction to a multiple brigade organization. And so that's really it. I wanted most of this time to be question and answer. How I see this going forward. And as I said earlier, there were 2 signal commands. One is assigned to the Pacific. It's in Hawaii. Rich DeBrill, who's sitting here, served in that command. And so they work day to day. They don't have 4 boxes like I do. They have 1 with maybe a side small box to Army Cyber for communication tasking orders, but they have a pretty streamlined chain of command. They have a side small box for readiness to come to the Army Reserve, but everybody in that headquarters, the majority of them are currently on full-time orders because it's kind of hard to be a part-time Army Reservist and travel every weekend to Hawaii. It gets pretty expensive if you do that. And so they have a higher staff element. And my headquarters, just like theirs, is multi-compo. Not many Army Reserve units are that. So I have my G3, both the one in Kuwait, is a full-time active component colonel. And much of my G3 shop back here in East Point, about 26 people are full-time active Army soldiers. They get assigned here for 3 years, and then they'll go on to somewhere else, 18th Airborne Corps, 82nd Airborne Division, whatever assignment takes them going forward. And so that makes the 335th the only expeditionary signal command in the Army Reserve. And we are working to start to peel back that commitment to Southwest Asia, as I talked about earlier, so we can become globally available. With the new National Defense Strategy, the Southwest Asia mission really fell to priority number 4, even though, as we all know, it's been the tip of the mountain for the past 20 years. That's just not the way going forward. Our top 2 adversaries, 8 months ago, it was Russia, China. With the new administration, it's now China, Russia. But I will tell you, whether 8 months ago or now, the difference between 1 and 2 was very small in terms of capability. And you just have to turn on the news, as probably everybody heard the news with Belarus and the incident they pulled yesterday, and what that's going to do with tensions and exercises and muscle flexing in Europe. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yes, sir.
You understand the difference between signal, cyber, intel, but from a signal point of view, signal option, how does that migrate over to cyber and efficiency? How does signal work together with cyber? Where is that first place you need?
So important to anything, I almost look at it, the foundation of a house a house is only as good as its foundation. Okay? Cyber can only function on a network. And so the signal command does DoDN operations. You have to have pertinent and relative architecture in which to use to your own ability, or from which to fight and conduct offensive cyber capability as well. And you have to defend that domain. So there's an intricate length. And for the first time ever, up until I just deployed General Moyer to command the Signal Command in Kuwait, first time ever in the 335th, the 3 general officers, I have 2 deputies. I'm down to 1 right now. I'm a signal officer. I can spell cyber 4 out of 5 times right on a good day. My 1 deputy grew up as an information operations officer. And that is one domain where we are just scratching the surface. Quite frankly, when the Army does information operations, at this point, and that's part of our nation, part of our culture, we do counter messaging. We don't go out there and actively send out a message. Probably up until about a week ago, 80% of the world thought the United States Army started the COVID-19 pandemic. Because that was the message by our adversaries that got out there first. Nobody reads the retraction on page 3 of the New York Times, but they read the headline that was 3 days earlier, and that's what they remember. We as a culture, part of our culture is not to put out bad information, although I'm not saying advocating that's the way to go, but getting out proactive messaging ahead of the game really is going to be the focus of the Department of Defense Information Operations going forward. And then my other DCG has predominantly been a cyber officer most of his career, even though cyber as a branch is only 4.5 years old. We had cyber-like folks prior to the creation of cyber branch. So having that diversity at the upper levels in my command does help getting after what has traditionally been a signal role. But you can't do cyber if you don't have an infrastructure and a managed infrastructure from which to either defend and utilize for our own purposes or to attack from for offensive cyber capability. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes, sir.
Sir, the theme of this conference is cyber or physical. So signal, cyber, physical, 6 comes to you. Any input to joint or DoD levels, you, the leader, consider critical infrastructure and what the military needs. How does that align with the national definition?
So without keeping it at the unclassified level, in my previous job, did that often. Monthly would review defended asset lists and critical asset lists. Not all critical assets can be defended. It's a resource management issue at that point. But yes, and I will tell you, having that great relationship with my boss, General Cavoli, most of mine were in his top because infantry officers, armor officers that get to those upper commands, the Army is commanded by for the most part, by combat arms officers. They don't get to that level without understanding mission command and logistics. And so they're probably better logisticians than their G4. And General Cavoli, in many cases, was a better G6 than I was because he knew he had to be when it came to mission command. So there were certain things when the Soleimani killing, we were just talking about that at our lunch table, that happened about 2 years ago. When that happened, I was in Saturday talking with General Cavoli of what needed to happen, what assets we needed to go where, and what resources we needed to protect, so he had the ability to provide mission command if there was a retaliation in Army Europe. Yes, sir.
Sir, you talked about you're moving your focus from Southwest Asia to more global focus. Is that in addition to the mission set in Southwest Asia or instead of?
So I see, if I could enact the change tomorrow, there's other people with a vote, but I think the path we're going to is returning Southwest Asia to a brigade-level mission, much like you have right now in Europe. It's a brigade-level mission on day-to-day operations. There's very little tactical infrastructure remaining in Southwest Asia. We've been there for 20 years. We've built good roads and good fiber and good microwaves and excellent satellite systems in which you can have that capability done by the brigade commander that's in Southwest Asia. The problem is that brigade commander isn't like a regular TTSB, and so you really have to look. It's two nuts, but one's an almond, one's a walnut. I'm an analogy guy. But the 35th Signal Brigade and the 11th Signal Brigade on active duty are robust signal brigades. They have engineering capability that they can do engineering operations and planning for a multiple battalion employment. Those strategic signal brigades don't have that capability. There is talk right now to put in the TAA, which is our budget process for the Army, that in about 3 to 4 years you'll have that capability added to the MTO of those, the one in Hawaii, the one in Germany, and the one in Korea or in Southwest Asia, to make them look just like a TTSB when it comes to capability of people, but not have the trucks and tentage and camouflage that a deployable signal brigade would have. Sir. So right now, red teams are still done through the 780th MI Brigade, part of Army Cyber. We are going to provide that like capability for Defender Europe going up. One of my key messages I tell my folks is relationships matter. Having that relationship with Army Europe, we are going to provide from CONUS, because COVID restrictions are still in place in Europe for the most part, but be able to do some red team cyber assessments on networks for Defender Europe 21 this summer. I think we can provide that capability, but right now it's, can we do it today? We are not structured to provide that on demand, but it is something I think we could build up to rather quickly. Sir.
Good work we all see with the Army Software Factory and application development, DevSecOps. Is that model, as you see going forward, is that something that you at their level and then deploy those findings that are high quality applications for the 335, et cetera, or are you going to
Most of those decisions really will be made at the Army Cyber Command level because as we stood up cyber, we've been inherently a joint Department of Defense for many, many years. But Cyber Command, when it was created, really is the first one where they established all subordinate organizations almost identical. You look at what a CPT is provided by the Department of, or the Navy, and even the Coast Guard has a CPT. Is that right, Jim? So even the Coast Guard provides one CPT. I provide 10. The Air Guard, or the National Guard through the Air Guard and Army Guard provide 11. And they're all identical. And the training is all identical. And so the capability and the equipment set and the software applications really would be, I hate to defer a question, but General Steve Hager, old friend of mine, I've followed him many, many times in my career. He is going to be in the decision group that will make that determination going forward. Would you add, one time I may throw a lifeline out to you on this one, Jim. Would you have anything else to add to that question?
John's right on. Because the cyber national is standardized, we have that capability. Large CPP that's here in Georgia, just like the 10 CPP based on just like the there's Air Force and Army CPP in Hawaii. They have the almost exact same intel. Air Force
And a lot of that goodness is passing along. You look at the F-35 Strike Fighter. It's going to be employed by all three services. That is one of the first joint acquisitions I think we've had in a long, long time. You look at a Marine rifle company, it looks nothing like an Army rifle company. They're completely different. They both might have M4s, or in the Marine Corps' case, still M16s. You know, they may have an M1A1 in the Marine Corps, whereas we have, you know, more modern M1A2. So it's not quite the same. But going forward, just with the efficiencies, you're not going to see service unique procurement going forward, or as much as we've had for 50 to 60 years. Sir.
Hey, good afternoon, sir. I'm a technical writer, and I know that cybersecurity has a lot to do with writing technical manuals, for the operations people and engineers. So what are your experiences, or what are your thoughts on how your team, or technical team, has and what are the challenges?
I think we're, in many cases, we're writing them as we go, or often case, we're correcting the technical manuals that are already out there with the way we're employing our forces. Right now, the 39 people that make up a cyber protection team, we don't know if that's the right answer. That is always under observation, and what makes up that team, and then really how we employ it. It's great right now from a training and a resourcing and a sustainment model that we have right now. But as we deploy multiple CPTs to Army Europe, for example, or not Army Europe, to EUCOM, CPTs go to the COCOM level, nothing goes to the service component level. They're finding out we don't need all 39. Even with the deployments that I've had with some CPTs with Fort Gordon and Army Cyber proper, they're really relooking the model and in doing defensive cyber operations on civilian infrastructure, if that's what they're doing for that segment in time, is the intel analyst piece or the targeting piece of that CPT appropriate for that mission. And so we're constantly evolving. So I don't know if that answered your question or was a little wishy-washy. And we're the worst people. Army writes great doctrine, but then we don't follow it.
And I just want to follow up with that. I'm prior Navy, and a few years ago, our team was in AFCEA. We were trying to assemble a satellite radar system, ships in port. And so basically, the technical manual that came with the satellite did radar system, and we were under pressure to assemble this under time state. And so I was able to write the manual as a technical writer all the way to Asia news one generally. So I noticed that a lot. Where getting inside of it or kind of biased by someone else.
And trying to keep this also at the unclassified level, and you'll see with cyber, what is a TTP today is not a TTP 11 months from now. And quite frankly, technical manuals can't keep up with the state of current operations, particularly if something is evolving as cyber. There's been times where they've been ready to enact an operation, but then the adversary has changed their techniques over that period of time, and what they were going to do is going to be ineffective. So with the constant change, Moore's Law, we all know, is about 18 months when it comes to purchasing of IT infrastructure. It is probably weeks when it comes to cyber techniques and tactics.
So I think we've got time for one more. Questions?
Sure.
What can industry give us in place? Are there particular capabilities process
So you're going to get the most honest, blunt answer out of me that probably will get me in trouble with most of my peers. But I think it is the right thing to go. Having been the receiver 30 years ago, I was a platoon leader fielding MSE in 1992 at Fort Bragg. That was a system designed by the French in 1975, and we were saying it was the most modern piece of kit that was coming out, and it was 17 plus years old. And our cell phone was a 1393 or whatever that big old box was. They were about this big, and you had a 6-man team that would set up a row that at the end of the day affiliated 8 mobile telephones. Just absolutely astronomical case. We, as an Army, is stuck to a program of record. And I don't think it works for IT equipment. I don't think it can work. I talked about Moore's Law earlier. By the time you come and fielding schedule, and then all the kit that goes with it to provide that sustainment, by the time you're now in a current computer set, but you're purchasing computers with Pentium 4s, would be the equivalent today. I used to say 8088s, and then people in the audience didn't know what that was. They do know what a Pentium 4 is. We're getting to that age. On my home Dell laptop, if my mouse goes bad, I don't call up Dell. I don't call up the company I bought it from and ask for a replacement mouse. I go to Staples, and I buy whatever mouse is cheapest that day. And if it breaks, I throw it away and I go out and buy another mouse. But what I do care about is IEEE or industry standards. And so the USB 3.0 needs to be the standard. The poor SOBs, if there's any of them in the room, that iOmega drive was great for about 9 months. And no one can ever probably find an iOmega drive anymore, but it was a one of a kind. All peripherals. And you look at the different radios we have in the Army right now, depending on the make and model of that radio, the handset, that's a universal handset, but the connector to go to the radio varies by the radio manufacturer. So therefore, you inherently have to have a program of record. So I have a constant supply or a warehouse of replacement handsets. Do an industry standard on the handset connector. And now I just buy a handset from whoever is making it that day. And so signal equipment going forward, we're getting ready to go through an ESB enhanced conversion. And I'll tell you, by the time we field Battalion 22, we're going to be refielding Battalion 1. It's like you never get done painting the Golden Gate Bridge. As soon as you're done, you're starting all over again. It's always being painted. And so we're not going to have 22 signal battalions in the Army that look identical. But what capabilities does it provide? And so, in my mind, I need a program of record for the prime mover, the Humvee, okay, because nobody else uses that. I need a supply of gaskets and seals for the prime mover, the vehicle that hosts the shelter. The shelter can be standardized. And then industry standards on rack depth, rack width, rack height, power, HVAC considerations, and then whatever is the best thing the industry can provide that day that fits those rack specs, that's what I buy that day. And if something goes bad, I don't go to a war stock replacement kit. I call up an online vendor, and they give me the best router available that day that's probably the cheapest. Because if I'm buying a router that was designed and configured 6 years ago, it's probably going to cost me 3-4 times more than the brand new, more powerful router that I want to slide into that rack. So I don't think we can have program of record for standardized modular signal equipment sets going forward in the future. That is Phillips' opinion. That is not the opinion of the United States Army, but I think we need to heavily leverage that. You need programs of records for tanks and for helicopters. But for the guts of our signal equipment, it should be what is best available that day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
For being here.